I have two 6x12 pieces of fabric, and I'm going to be pinning them together to sew my seam right sides together. Since my fabric looks the same on both sides, I've noted which side I'm using as my right side. So I'm going to place these down and pin them along the edge I'm sewing. I'm using my stitch guide on my machine to line up my fabric at 1/2 of an inch, which is my seam allowance. If you were using a different length seam allowance, you would line it up against that mark instead. So at the top of my stitch, I'm going to go forward a few stitches, then back stitch, and then continue my way down the rest of the seam. And back stitch when I get to the bottom. So now that my seam is sewn, you would start by pressing open the seam. You can see that I have my right sides are showing on the outside. We'll flip it open. And first we're going to press open our seam like normal. Do the front side as well. So now my seam's nice and flat. I'm going to fold my seam back over. I want to take just one section of my seam allowance, so I'm tucking the other side around, and I'm going to fold this over in half. Take some pins. Iron over that. Take out my pins. So now I have one side that's folded over. Now I'm going to continue and do the same thing on the other side. Flip it back. So I just have one layer of seam allowance here. So now I have both. Now I'm ironing over. Again, just to make sure everything's flat. And if you have some fraying seam allowance like I do, I'm just going to trim a little bit of the fray. So now that my seam allowance on both sides is folded over in half, I'm going to flip it over to one side, again making sure that my seam allowance is on the other side, and then I just have one layer of seam allowance. Now we're going to stitch along this seam allowance, holding that fold in place. I'm going to follow that line. You can use a section of your arms. So now I'm going to place my seam allowance under my presser foot. making sure that my needle is in my fabric, following down my fold, point where I'm close enough to this fold, but still catching all my seam allowance. Since I have a small seam allowance now, I folded down 1/2 inch into 1/4. About halfway down my seam allowance is a good place. You can use a section of your seam allowance as a guide. You can follow with your eye along this, I'm keeping in mind that it's at about the center point of this part of my presser foot, or you could use your stitch line and keep parallel to that, but it's helpful to have something to follow as a straight guideline. Make sure to backstitch at the start and stop of your stitch. So now if I flip over to this side, my seam allowance is sewn down. I have a stitch that's just on my seam allowance. This back side is caught, and this will stop it from fraying, and it keeps my seam nicely folded under. So now I'm going to do the same thing on the other side. I'm making sure that I'm not catching anything else under my seam allowance. Now you can see I have my seam allowance stitched under nicely, and it's close enough in that my frays won't pop out, but I'm not catching anything on the other side. I'm going to give it one more press from the back side here, one more from the front, so my seams lie nice. Clean on one side and stitched under on the other.